How debt can be your greatest asset. For Audiobook, Chapter 1, The Hidden Nature of Debt. You have been taught to fear debt since you were old enough to understand what money was. Every adult around you repeated the same warning. Do not borrow, do not owe, avoid credit cards, pay everything in cash, and if you must take a loan, pay it off as quickly as possible. Debt was painted as a monster hiding under your bed, a shadow that could ruin your life if you let it come too close. And there is some truth in that picture, because countless families have been crushed by bills, late payments, and interest rates spiraling out of control. Yet what almost nobody told you is that debt also has another face, one that is less terrifying and more empowering, a side that has been used by the wealthiest people in history to build empires, companies, and fortunes. This hidden nature of debt is what you are about to explore, and it might challenge everything you once believed. Imagine standing in front of a library filled with heavy volumes, each one containing the life story of a wealthy entrepreneur. If you open a biography of a steel magnate from the 19th century, or a real estate tycoon from the late 20th century, or even a technology founder from the digital age, you would find debt written in those pages like an invisible character. They did not become powerful by simply stacking coins and saving every dollar under the mattress. They used other people's money to build faster, reach higher, and multiply what they already had. Where an ordinary person saw danger, they saw leverage. Where most saw chains, they saw wings. You might think that this perspective belongs only to the rich, that it is out of reach for someone who earns an ordinary salary or runs a modest business. But pause for a moment and consider this. Every time you see a new apartment building rise in your city, every time you see a restaurant expand into a second location, every time you hear a young entrepreneur starting a company with almost no personal capital, you are witnessing the hidden nature of debt in action. The owners did not wait until they had a mountain of savings before they took the leap. They borrowed, structured, and accepted the responsibility of repaying in exchange for possibility of creating something larger than their current means would allow. Debt at its essence is simply time borrowed from the future. When you take a loan, you are saying to the lender, allow me to use tomorrow's resources today because I can create enough value to pay you back and still come out ahead. That is the secret. If you borrow for consumption, like buying clothes you do not need or gadgets that lose value the moment you open a box, you are stealing from your future self and leaving them weaker. But if you borrow to create, to invest, to multiply, then you are making a deal with your future self that leaves them richer, stronger, and freer. The line between disaster and opportunity is not the existence of debt itself, but the reason you take it on and the discipline with which you manage it. Picture a young man named Daniel in 1987. He works at a modest job in Chicago, earning just enough to cover rent and groceries. Daniel has always wanted to open a small printing business, but the cost of equipment is overwhelming. A commercial printer capable of handling bulk orders costs nearly $20,000, a number far beyond his savings. He could spend 10 years working overtime, cutting every personal expense, and maybe reach that number. But by then, the opportunity would have vanished, and someone else would have captured the market. Instead, Daniel makes a different choice. He approaches a local bank, presents his plan, and secures a loan for $20,000. Overnight, his dream becomes possible. Within 2 years, Daniel has grown his client list, repaid half the loan, and doubled his income. Was the debt a risk? Absolutely. But without it, there would have been no business, no clients, no growth. What others might call dangerous, Daniel recognized as a tool. The same principle plays out on much larger scales. Think of the vast skyscrapers of New York, the ones that scrape the clouds and dominate the skyline. Do you believe those towers were built only with the owner's savings? Of course not. They were financed through massive loans, bonds, and complex structures of credit. Those who dared to take on debt, those who understood its hidden nature, reshaped cities, and carved their names into history. Debt was not their enemy. It was their ally, their engine, their greatest asset. Yet for most people, the very word still sparks fear. That fear is not entirely irrational. You have seen neighbors lose their homes because of mortgage defaults. You have watched friends drown in student loans that follow them for decades. You may even have experienced the cold hand of debt collectors calling your phone. These experiences etch scars, and the scars produce a belief that debt is evil. But beliefs can be misleading. What matters is not whether you carry debt, but whether that debt is working for you or against you. If it buys you freedom, if it produces income greater than its cost, it is an asset. If it drains you and chains you, it is a liability. The paradox is that the same instrument can play both songs, depending entirely on how you use it. Consider another example, one closer to the ground. A young woman named Sophia inherits a small piece of land from her grandmother in 2003. The land sits on the outskirts of a growing town, worth perhaps $50,000 at the time. Sophia dreams of building a row of small rental houses there, but the construction would cost at least $100,000. She does not have that amount, nor does she want to sell the land. So she goes to the bank and borrows $100,000, using the land as collateral. Within a year, the houses are built. Within 2 years, the rent from tenants covers the mortgage payments and leaves her with additional income. 10 years later, the houses are fully paid off, and Sophia owns property worth several times her original inheritance. If she had refused debt, she would still have the same empty piece of land. By embracing strategically, she turned her inheritance into a thriving source of wealth. When you look at these stories, a pattern begins to emerge. Debt is not simply about numbers on a contract. It is about vision, discipline, and courage. You must see beyond a fear of owing and recognize the potential of creating. You must discipline yourself to borrow only for purposes that yield greater value. And you must summon the courage to step into uncertainty, trusting that the future you are building will be strong enough to carry the weight of the obligation. Debt, in this sense, becomes a bridge. On one side stands your current reality, limited by what you can save and accumulate. On the other side lies the opportunity you cannot reach with savings alone. Debt is the structure that lets you cross that gap. But like any bridge, it requires careful construction. Too heavy a load and it collapses. Poor foundations and it crumbles. That is why so many fear it. They have seen bridges collapse, and they assume every bridge must collapse. Yet, when built properly, when crossed wisely, it does not just carry you across, it carries you higher. The hidden nature of debt is that it amplifies who you are. If you are reckless, it magnifies your recklessness. If you are disciplined, it magnifies your discipline. If you seek consumption, it multiplies your emptiness. If you seek creation, it multiplies your abundance. Debt is neither angel nor demon. It is a mirror that reflects your choices. As you let this truth settle, notice how your perspective begins to shift. You no longer see debt only as the monster waiting to swallow you whole. You begin to see it as a tool, sharp and dangerous, but also precise and powerful in the right hands. And perhaps for the first time, you realize that debt itself is neutral. What you do with it determines whether it imprisons you or liberates you. In that realization, a door opens. The door to seeing debt not as a curse to be avoided, but as a hidden ally waiting to be mastered. You might still feel uneasy hearing the claim that debt can be your greatest asset. Years of conditioning are hard to erase, and the voice of caution whispers loudly inside you. It says that owing money is dangerous, that it is better to move slowly and avoid risk altogether. But deep down, you also know that playing safe has its limits. You can only save so much from each paycheck. You can only cut expenses to a certain degree. You cannot shrink your way into wealth. At some point, growth requires expansion, and expansion almost always calls for resources beyond what you currently hold in your hands. That is where the hidden potential of debt begins to reveal itself. Think of a seed in the ground. By itself, it contains potential, but without water, soil, and sunlight, it will never grow into a tree. Your ideas, ambitions, and dreams are like those seeds. You can keep them locked inside your mind, waiting for the perfect conditions, hoping that one day your savings will be enough to plant them. But the years pass, inflation eats at your money, and opportunities slip away. Debt, when understood correctly, is like borrowing water to feed that seed now, trusting that the tree it grows into will provide shade, fruit, and more seeds in the future. The danger is not in using the water, but in pouring it on barren ground. History offers countless examples of how entire nations have relied on debt to rise. Consider the United States after the Second World War. The government had borrowed astronomical amounts, over $200 billion, an unheard of figure at the time. Many feared that such debt would destroy the country. Instead, those funds financed the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan, supported returning soldiers with the GI Bill, and built infrastructure that fueled decades of prosperity. Was there risk? Absolutely. But the decision to borrow strategically laid the foundation for what became the greatest economic expansion of the 20th century. The same principle applies to you on a personal level. When debt is used to build, it can change your entire trajectory. Let's step into a more personal story. Imagine Maria in 2008, a single mother living in Miami. She worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat, always hearing the same advice from relatives. Stay away from loans, you will drown. But Maria had an eye for properties. She noticed that houses which had been worth $300,000 a year before were now being sold for less than $150,000 due to the financial crisis. She had little in savings, certainly not enough to buy one outright. With courage, she approached a small community bank and secured a mortgage with favorable terms. Everyone told her she was crazy. But within 5 years, the housing market recovered, and the property she bought for $150,000 was worth nearly $300,000 again. The rent she collected during those years covered her mortgage payments and provided extra cash for her family. What others saw as a trap, she recognized as a door. That single act of borrowing transformed her financial life. There is something deeply psychological about how you perceive debt. If you see it as a punishment, you will avoid it at all costs, even when it could serve you. If you see it as freedom, you might abuse it recklessly. The true power lies in holding both truths at once. Debt is dangerous, but precisely because it is dangerous, it carries immense potential. It is like fire, left unattended. Fire consumes everything in its path. But harnessed carefully, fire cooks your meals, warms your home, and powers engines that carry you across continents. The same flame that destroys can also sustain. Debt is no different. Now, let's bring it closer to your everyday decisions. Imagine you have an idea for a small online business. You need a computer, software, and a few $1,000s of advertising to launch. You could wait 3 years to save up $10,000. Or you could take a loan today for $10,000, set up the business, and begin generating income within months. If your plan is sound, if your product meets demand, you may earn enough within the first year to repay the loan and still have a profit. You have borrowed from your future. But by doing so, you create a future that would not have existed otherwise. This is the hidden nature of debt. It can accelerate your timeline, collapsing years of waiting into the present moment. Critics will argue that this view encourages recklessness, that it teaches people to dive into loans without caution. But notice the nuance. The hidden power of debt is not an invitation to irresponsibility. It is an invitation to discipline. To use debt well, you must evaluate opportunities with clarity. You must calculate the difference between the cost of borrowing and the potential return. If the return outweighs the cost, debt is a tool. If not, it is a trap. Too many people never learn to make this distinction, and so they throw all debt into the same bucket and call it dangerous. The wealthy separate them. They understand that borrowing $10,000 for a vacation is foolish, but borrowing $10,000 for an asset that produces $20,000 return is wise. Let's take a concrete illustration. Suppose you borrow $50,000 at an annual interest of 5%. That means each year you owe $2,500 in interest. If you use that loan to buy a depreciating car, you've gained nothing but temporary pleasure and ongoing expense. But if you use the same $50,000 to purchase equipment for a landscaping company, and that equipment allows you to take contracts that generate $30,000 a year in new revenue, suddenly the debt is not a burden. It is a lever. You are paying $2,500 a year to gain $30,000. That spread is the essence of turning debt into an asset. You might wonder why this simple truth is not taught more openly. Part of the reason is cultural. In many communities, debt has been synonymous with shame. Families whisper about who owed money, who had fallen behind, who was in trouble. Schools taught the virtue of thrift, but rarely the mechanics of leverage. Meanwhile, those at the top quietly master the art of borrowing. They understood that capital was not meant to be hoarded but circulated, that money sitting idle loses value, while money in motion multiplies. The gap between those who fear debt and those who use it wisely becomes a gap between scarcity and abundance. There is also the matter of control. Lenders prefer borrowers who do not understand leverage, because those borrowers become trapped in consumer loans and revolving credit. Entire industries profit from keeping you ignorant of debt's hidden nature. If you knew how to use debt against them, if you learned to borrow not for consumption but for creation, you would step out of their control. You would transform from a customer into a competitor, from a debtor into a builder. That shift of perspective is powerful, and it begins here, with you realizing that debt is not simply what you were taught to fear. Picture yourself standing at a crossroads. On one side is a path of avoidance, the safe road where you never borrow a cent, where you live only within the boundaries of your current resources. On the other side is a path of mastery, where you take debt carefully, shape it into a tool, and let it amplify your potential. The first road is comfortable but limited. The second road is uncomfortable but expansive. Both carry risks, but only one has a possibility of turning debt into your greatest asset. As this first chapter closes, let the thought settle deeply. Debt is not the monster you were told to run from, nor is it the magic potion that guarantees riches. It is a force, powerful and neutral, waiting for the hand that directs it. Whether it enslaves you or empowers you depends entirely on whether you dare to understand its hidden nature and whether you have the courage to use it wisely. The world does not present debt to you in a neutral way. From the moment you open your first bank account, advertisements and institutions push you toward one side of the spectrum, the side of easy consumption. They hand you credit cards with glossy designs, promise airline miles, hotel points, or discount on groceries, and quietly hope you never pay the full balance. This is a domain of bad debt, because it thrives on your impatience. It whispers, "Have it now, worry later," and later always arrives, carrying the weight of compounding interest and lost opportunities. To see through the illusion, you must train your eyes to distinguish which debts are designed to enslave and which are designed to empower. Think of the story of Michael, a college graduate in 2009. He was offered a credit card with a $5,000 limit to build his credit score. At first, he only used it for gas and small expenses, but soon he was swiping it for nights out, new clothes, and weekend trips. By the end of the year, his balance was $4,000. He promised himself he would pay it off quickly, but life happened. Car repairs, medical bills, a short stretch of unemployment. Within 3 years, his balance ballooned to nearly $9,000 because of late fees and 24% annual interest. Michael learned the hard way that bad debt does not wait patiently. It multiplies quietly in the shadows, consuming more than he ever expected. Now compare that to Lena, who in the same year borrowed $100,000 to purchase a small duplex in a growing neighborhood. Her mortgage payment was $800 each month. She rented out both units for $1,000 each, collecting $2,000 in rent. After covering the mortgage, maintenance, and insurance, she still pocketed nearly $900 monthly. Within 10 years, not only had the property appreciated to $180,000, but the tenants had effectively paid off half the mortgage for her. Where Michael's debt chained him to late-night stress and angry phone calls from collectors, Lena's debt bought her financial breathing room and set her on the path toward independence. Same concept, same word, but two radically different outcomes. This contrast illustrates the core truth. The quality of debt depends not on the numbers on the paper, but on the purpose behind it. Bad debt is short-term gratification with long-term pain. Good debt is short-term responsibility with long-term gain. Bad debt makes you smaller. Good debt makes you bigger. And once you internalize this, you begin to evaluate every borrowing decision through a sharper lens. Let's ground this in numbers again. Suppose you borrow $10,000 at 10% interest annually. That means your cost is $1,000 each year. If you spend the loan on consumer electronics, those items will be worth a fraction of their price in 12 months, and the debt will still be chasing you. But if you use that same $10,000 to buy equipment for a small photography business, and you secure contracts that bring in $3,000 per year, your net after paying interest is $2,000 in profit. Over 5 years, You have not only repaid the loan, but also built a business that continues to feed you. Same debt, different destiny. This distinction has existed since the earliest days of commerce. In ancient Rome, farmers often borrowed seeds at planting season, agreeing to repay with part of their harvest. That was good debt, because it allowed them to survive the lean months and reap abundance later. At the same time, others borrowed money for extravagant banquets or festivals, sinking themselves into obligations that brought no lasting return. That was bad debt, and it ruined many noble families. Across centuries, the pattern remains unchanged. Debt-attached production builds civilizations, while debt-attached consumption destroys them. You might be wondering how to apply this in your daily life. Start by asking one question whenever you face the option of borrowing. Will this debt put money into my pocket, or will it take money out? If the answer is that it puts money in, whether through rent, business income, or skill acquisition, then you are looking at good debt. If the answer is that it drains money out, giving you nothing but fading memories or depreciating goods, then you are staring at bad debt. The simplicity of that question can guide you like a compass. Let us revisit the car example, because it often confuses people. Imagine two individuals, Thomas and Rachel, both buying vehicles worth $25,000. Thomas finances it through a 7-year loan and uses it only for commuting to his office job. The car begins losing value the moment he drives it, and within 5 years it is worth less than $10,000 while he still owes money. Rachel, on the other hand, buys the same car on the same terms, but uses it to launch a ride-sharing side business. Within the first year, she earns nearly $15,000 from driving. Even after expenses and loan payments, she pockets several thousand. By the time her loan is finished, the car has paid for itself many times over. Same loan, same car, but Thomas's debt is bad while Rachel's debt is good, because hers was tied to income production. The danger is that bad debt is easier to recognize only after it has already trapped you. The credit card bill arrives months later. The student loan lingers years after graduation. The finance sofa feels old while the payments still remain. That is why discipline and foresight are essential. You must learn to pause before borrowing and imagine your future self standing at the end of that road. Do they thank you for planting seeds that grew into trees, or do they curse you for leaving them with a barren field and heavy chains? The vision of that future self should guide your choices in the present. The wealthy have always mastered this discipline. They know that if they borrow $1 million at 6% interest, their annual cost is $60,000. If they invest that million into an asset producing $150,000 annually, they pocket $90,000 after paying the bank. To them, the debt is not scary, it is math. The gap between what it costs and what it earns is the measure of whether it's good or bad. Ordinary people shy away from this because the numbers seem large, but the principle is the same at every scale, whether it's 10,000 or 1 million. The question remains, does this debt work for me or against me? Debt, then, is like a servant. A good servant manages your house, multiplies your harvest, and protects your wealth. A bad servant eats your food, steals your time, and leaves you weaker. But you are the master who chooses which servant to hire. Each loan contract is a decision about whether you invite a builder into your life or a thief. That awareness alone can change how you approach money forever. As you let these truths sink in, you begin to see the labels good and bad not as vague concepts but as living realities. They are not abstract theories. They play out in every paycheck, every contract, every swipe of a card. And as you stand in front of those choices, you realize that learning to separate them is not optional if you want to break free from financial fear. It is a dividing line between those who remain forever trapped in scarcity and those who build lasting abundance. Chapter 2, Good Debt, Bad Debt. You've probably heard people throw around the phrase good debt and bad debt, but rarely does anyone pause to explain what those words truly mean in a way that cuts through the noise. It is easy to label all borrowing as bad, because the pain of bills piling up and interest mounting is real and has scarred millions. Yet lumping every type of debt into one basket is like saying that every flame burns houses down. It misses the truth that fire, when controlled, is what bakes your bread, warms your home, and powers the engines of progress. The same is true with borrowing. There is a sharp and vital distinction between debt that drains you and debt that builds you, between debt that keeps you small and debt that makes you larger than life. If you're going to unlock the possibility of turning debt into your greatest asset, you must learn to recognize the difference. Imagine walking into a bank in 2005. You see one person applying for a credit card with a $10,000 limit, so they can buy luxury clothes, the newest television, and a vacation they cannot afford. You see another person applying for a mortgage of the same $10,000 as a down payment on a rental property that will bring in steady rent month after month. Both leave the bank with debt. Yet 10 years later, one is sitting under the weight of high-interest credit card bills while the other is cashing rent checks and watching their property grow in value. The principle is simple. Bad debt takes from you, while good debt works for you. Bad debt is seductive because it feels rewarding in the moment. It lets you drive the car sooner, wear the clothes now, sit in the restaurant tonight. It whispers a lie that you can have everything today without waiting for tomorrow. But tomorrow always comes, and it brings a heavy price tag. Interest rates on consumer credit are designed to enslave. A $5,000 balance at 20% annual interest can double in less than 4 years if you pay only the minimum. That means a pair of shoes that cost you $100 on credit could effectively drain hundreds more from your future self. The illusion of affordability hides a harsh truth. Every swipe of the card that is not tied to creation is a silent death from the person you will be later. Now, picture another scenario. A young man named Robert borrows $20,000 to attend a technical program in information technology in 2012. He graduates within a year and secures a job paying $60,000 annually, double what he earned before. He repays a loan within 4 years and continues to enjoy the higher income for decades. That debt, though it felt heavy at the start, was good debt. It was tied to growth, to skill, to income. It was an investment disguised as an obligation. The key difference lies in the return. If the cost of the loan is smaller than the wealth it unlocks, you have stepped into the realm of good debt. The dividing line is not always obvious in the moment, and that is why so many stumble. Take cars, for example. Most people borrow to buy one, and in many cases, that loan is bad debt because the vehicle depreciates the moment it leaves the lot. But what if you drive for a ride-sharing service or use the car for a delivery business? Suddenly, the loan that seemed destructive becomes productive. The same object can flip from liability to asset, depending on how you use it. That is why you cannot rely on labels alone. You must look deeper and ask, does this borrowing create future value greater than its cost, or does it drain me the moment I sign the contract? Consider a concrete illustration with numbers. Suppose you borrow $50,000 at 5% interest annually. If you spend that on furniture, vacations, and gadgets, the only return you get is fleeting pleasure. In 10 years, you've paid over $25,000 in interest, and all the items you bought are broken, lost, or outdated. But if you use the same $50,000 as a down payment on a small apartment building that generates $1,500 a month in rent, you will be collecting $18,000 annually. Even after paying interest and expenses, you would likely net more than $10,000 each year. In that case, the loan becomes a generator of wealth instead of a siphon of it. This principle explains why many wealthy individuals are comfortable holding millions in debt. To an outsider, it might look insane to owe so much. But when that debt is tied to assets producing cash flow far beyond the cost of the loan, the burden becomes leverage. It is no different than holding a lever that moves a mountain with a fraction of the effort. The debt is not crushing them. It is lifting them. The tragedy is that most people encounter debt first through its bad form. A credit card in college, a payday loan, a store installment plan, all designed to trap you in consumption. They learn to associate debt with stress and shame, never realizing that another form of it exists, one that can empower rather than enslave. This lack of education keeps millions locked in fear or misuse, while those who learn the difference quietly step ahead. Let me tell you about a couple named James and Evelyn in 1998. They wanted to open a small bakery in their town, but had only $10,000 in savings. The ovens, counters, and rent would cost them nearly $50,000. They took out a loan for $40,000, nervous but hopeful. For the first year, they worked long nights, worried about every bill. But soon their pastries gained a reputation, and customers filled the shop each morning. Within 5 years, the bakery was debt-free, and today it stands as a thriving business, supporting their entire family. The $40,000 loan that could have crushed them instead became the seed of their livelihood. The difference between their story and that of someone drowning in consumer debt is not luck. It is purpose. They borrowed for creation, not consumption. When you hear the words good debt from now on, let them remind you of this truth. Good debt is any obligation that funds growth greater than its cost. Bad debt is any obligation that steals from your future self without return. The clarity of this distinction can change how you see every financial choice from this day forward. It can turn hesitation into strategy and fear into confidence. And once you begin to walk with this awareness, you will never look at borrowing the same way again. Chapter 3, Leverage, the silent multiplier. When you hear the word leverage, you might picture a long wooden bar resting on a rock, lifting a boulder larger than any man could move alone. That image is ancient, yet it captures exactly what financial leverage is: the ability to move mountains with tools you could never build by yourself. Leverage is a silent multiplier hidden inside debt, the reason why some people transform modest beginnings into extraordinary wealth. It does not change who you are, but it amplifies what you already carry: your discipline, your vision, or your recklessness. To understand the power of leverage, you must first understand that money by itself is slow. If you save $100 every month, after 1 year, you have only $1,200. After 10 years, you have $12,000. Useful, yes, but slow. Leverage takes that same $1,200 and turns it into control over $10,000 or even $100,000, depending on how wisely you borrow. With that, you can invest in property, expand a business, or enter markets that would otherwise be locked away for decades. The wealthiest individuals on earth did not get there by waiting patiently for their savings to grow. They used leverage to compress time. Imagine you want to buy a house worth $200,000. Without leverage, you would need to save that entire amount before stepping into ownership. For many, that would take 20 or 30 years, by which point the house might cost twice as much due to inflation. With leverage, you put down $20,000 as a deposit and borrow the remaining $180,000. Overnight, you control the entire property. If the house rises in value by just 10%, you gain $20,000, doubling your original investment. That is leverage. The bank supplied the bulk of capital, but you receive the majority of the growth. This principle can be seen across history. Consider the railroads of the 19th century. No single individual had enough gold to lay tracks across thousands of miles. Entrepreneurs borrowed heavily from banks and investors, using leverage to build infrastructure that reshaped nations. Each mile of track was debt-financed, yet each mile became an artery of commerce, multiplying wealth across entire regions. Without leverage, progress would have crawled. With it, progress sprinted. Let us step into a more personal story. In 2002, a man named David inherited a small grocery store from his father. It was profitable but modest, earning about $40,000 in yearly profit. David wanted to expand into a larger building, add more product lines, and modernize the space. The cost was daunting: $250,000. He did not have that kind of cash, and if he waited to save it, competitors would surpass him. Instead, he went to the bank, leveraged the equity in his current store, and borrowed the money. Within 3 years, his profits had tripled, reaching $120,000 annually. He repaid the loan in less than a decade, and today his chain of stores earns millions. Leverage was a silent multiplier that turned a neighborhood shop into a regional enterprise. Numbers can show this with clarity. Suppose you invest $10,000 of your own money in a stock that rises 10% in a year. You make $1,000 in profit. Now imagine you borrowed an additional $40,000 at 5% interest. You invest a total $50,000, and again the stock rises 10%. That is $5,000 in profit. After paying $2,000 in interest, you are left with $3,000 net, triple what you would have earned on your own. The risk is higher, yes, but the principle is undeniable. Leverage multiplies outcomes. Yet the silent multiplier does not discriminate. Just as it can multiply gains, it can magnify losses. If the same stock dropped by 10%, your $50,000 investment would lose $5,000. After paying $2,000 in interest, you will be down $7,000 total, with only $10,000 of your own money at stake. You would have lost 70% of your capital. This is why leverage is both powerful and perilous. It does not change the game, it makes the game faster. Wins arrive sooner and larger, but so do losses. The difference between those who thrive and those who collapse is not the existence of leverage, but the wisdom of its application. Consider another story, this time with caution. A young couple, Mark and Olivia, borrowed heavily in 2006 to buy 3 investment properties. They believed the housing market would always rise. For a while, they collected rent and felt unstoppable. But when the financial crisis struck in 2008, property values fell by nearly half. Their tenants lost jobs, rent payments stopped, and suddenly their leveraged empire became a crushing weight. They had borrowed too much, too fast, without building safety nets. The same multiplier that had made them feel powerful turned into a blade that cut deeply. What these stories teach you is that leverage is not good or bad by itself. It is like a magnifying glass focusing sunlight. In the hands of a child, it burns holes in paper. In the hands of scientists, it ignites discoveries. In your hands, it can either sear away your financial stability or light the path to freedom. That is why learning how to handle leverage is not optional if you aspire to grow beyond the limits of your own savings. At its core, leverage is about trust. The lender trusts that you will repay, and you trust that your investment will produce more than the cost of borrowing. It is a delicate balance, built on numbers but powered by vision. If you borrow with no clear plan, you invite disaster. But if you borrow with clarity, discipline, and foresight, you harness the very same tool that built railroads, skyscrapers, and businesses that still stand today. As you breathe in this understanding, you begin to realize something profound. The rich are not rich simply because they are more. They are rich because they think differently about money. Where others see borrowing as a sign of weakness, they see it as a lever. Where others wait decades to save enough, they step boldly with leverage and seize opportunities while they are ripe. This mindset, once adopted, can change not only your finances but the way you see time itself. Leverage shrinks time. It brings tomorrow's possibilities into today's hands. And as you stand at the edge of this truth, you can feel the tension. The power to multiply your life through leverage is real, but so is a danger being multiplied in the wrong direction. The silent multiplier does not forgive carelessness. It demands respect, discipline, and a vision larger than fear. The power of leverage can be difficult to grasp until you experience it firsthand, because it moves quietly in the background of every financial system. Banks themselves operate almost entirely on leverage. When you deposit $1,000, they do not lock that money in a vault with your name on it. They lend out the majority, sometimes $900 of it, to someone else, multiplying credit far beyond the actual cash they hold. That loan becomes another deposit somewhere else, which is again loaned out, rippling through the economy. A single $1,000 can expand into tens of thousands in circulating credit. This is leverage at a systemic level, and it explains why entire economies rise and fall on the back of borrowed trust. Now, think of how this principle flows into your own life. Suppose you have $50,000 saved. You could use it to buy one small property outright, earning perhaps $500 a month in rent. Or you could use it as a down payment on 5 properties worth $250,000 each, borrowing the rest from banks. Suddenly, you control assets worth over $1 million. Each property might net only $300 monthly after expenses, but across 5 properties that is $1,500, triple the income of owning one property. Over time, as tenants pay down your mortgages and property values rise, you're not merely an owner. You are a builder of wealth. The silent multiplier has turned $50,000 into control over $1 million, something no savings account could ever achieve in the same period. Leverage does not only apply to real estate. Entrepreneurs use it constantly. Consider a woman named Caroline who in 2014 dreamed of opening a cafe in Portland. She had $20,000 in personal savings, but the equipment, permits, renovations, and initial inventory would cost at least $150,000. If she waited to save the rest, she might never open. Instead, she borrowed $130,000 from a local credit union. The cafe opened within 6 months. Within 2 years, her annual revenue reached $400,000. Even after repaying the loan, Caroline enjoyed profits far beyond what she could have earned at her old office job. Without leverage, her dream would have remained a fantasy. With leverage, it became a living business employing a dozen people. But leverage can also magnify personal habits in ways you may not anticipate. If you are disciplined, it accelerates your discipline. If you are careless, it accelerates your carelessness. Imagine 2 college graduates, both borrowing $30,000 in student loans. One studies engineering, graduates into a field paying $70,000 annually, and repays the debt within a few years. The other pursues a degree without clear career prospects, struggles to find work paying more than $30,000 annually, and carries a loan for decades. The same leverage, borrowing for education, produce opposite results depending on the vision and discipline of the borrower. This is why leverage cannot be separated from personal character. It does not operate in a vacuum. It amplifies who you are. To see this in numbers, picture investing $10,000 of your own money into a business venture. If the venture grows 20%, you earn $2,000. Now imagine you also borrowed $90,000 at 6% annual interest, investing a total of $100,000. A 20% gain yields $20,000. After paying $5,400 in interest, you still net $14,000, 7 times more than without leverage. The difference is staggering. Yet if the venture loses 20%, you are suddenly down $20,000 plus still the interest. With only $10,000 of your own, that loss wipes you out. This is the razor's edge of leverage. It multiplies both sides of the equation. This duality is why many fear it. They see headlines of bankruptcies, foreclosures, and companies collapsing under mountains of debt. They forget to notice that for every failure, there are countless quiet successes. Families building portfolios, businesses expanding, dreams realized, all because of leverage. Fear alone cannot guide you. What must guide you is respect for the tool and wisdom in its application. Consider a sobering example from 2008. Developers across Las Vegas borrowed heavily to build luxury condominiums, expecting never-ending growth. When the housing bubble burst, many of those projects stood half-finished, skeletons of concrete and steel abandoned to the desert. Billions were lost. Yet a handful of investors who kept cash reserves, managed risk carefully, and used leverage moderately survived the crash. Some even purchased those failed projects at steep discounts, finishing them and selling years later at massive profits. The lesson is not that leverage is evil. The lesson is that reckless leverage is a loaded gun, while disciplined leverage is a sharpened tool. The key to surviving with leverage is building safety nets. Smart borrowers keep reserves for emergencies, structure loans with manageable terms, and never assume that markets only rise. They calculate not only how much they can gain, but how much they can lose, and whether they can survive the worst-case scenario. This is the mindset of resilience. It transforms leverage from a gamble into a calculated risk, one that still carries danger but also carries immense reward. You can see this philosophy in action in everyday businesses. A restaurant owner borrows $50,000 to renovate their kitchen. They know that if sales dip, they still have savings to cover loan payments for 6 months. That cushion gives them time to adapt, find new customers, or cut costs without losing the business. Compare this to another restaurant that borrows the same amount with no reserves. A single slow season pushes them into default. Both use leverage, but only one respected its double edge. At its deepest level, leverage is about acceleration. It is a way of borrowing time, of taking tomorrow's potential and pulling it into today. Used well, it collapses decades of waiting into years of growth. Used poorly, it collapses years of stability into months of chaos. When you step into leverage with open eyes, you gain access to the same force that has shaped empires, built industries, and carved fortunes out of nothing. So as you stand here, reflecting on the silent multiplier, understand that it is not a secret reserved for the elite. It is available to you, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to treat it with the respect it demands. Leverage will not make you wealthy on its own, but combined with vision, discipline, and patience, it can carry you far beyond the limits of what your hands alone could ever build. Chapter 4: Stories of Strategic Borrowing. Numbers and definitions can teach you much about debt, but stories reach into your imagination and make the lesson unforgettable. When you hear about real people who use borrowing as a ladder instead of a chain, you begin to see yourself in them. Their struggles mirror your own hesitations. Their risks reflect your fears, and their triumphs whisper that perhaps you too could step beyond the limits of your current resources. Strategic borrowing is not theory. It is lived experience, and the lives of those who dare to borrow wisely can illuminate the path ahead. Consider the case of Anthony in 1972. He was the son of immigrants in New York, working in a small tailor shop where his father mended suits by hand. Anthony dreamed of opening his own clothing store, but he had barely $3,000 in savings. Renting a shop, buying fabric, and stocking inventory would require at least $20,000. Friends told him it was impossible, that he should keep working and saving until he had enough. But Anthony understood that if he waited 10 years, the city would change, competition would rise, and his chance would fade. He walked into a local bank, presented his business plan, and borrowed $17,000. The first year was grueling, filled with long nights and constant anxiety about making payments. Yet customers loved his designs, word spread, and within 3 years the shop was profitable enough to pay off the loan. By the time he turned 40, Anthony owned 3 boutiques across Manhattan. That initial debt, feared by many, was his stepping stone to success. Then there is the story of Hannah, a nurse in Chicago in 2001. She had always wanted to invest in real estate, but believed it was something only wealthy people could do. One day, she saw a duplex listed for $90,000 in a neighborhood beginning to attract young professionals. She had $10,000 saved, not nearly enough to buy it outright. But instead of dismissing the dream, she approached a lender, secured a mortgage, and used her savings for the down payment. She moved into one unit and rented out the other. The rent covered most of her mortgage, leaving her with only a small payment each month. 10 years later, the property was worth over $200,000, and the mortgage was nearly paid off. Hannah eventually repeated the process with a second property, then a third. What once felt out of reach became the foundation of her retirement plan, all because she dared to borrow strategically when the opportunity appeared. Strategic borrowing is not only about businesses or properties. Education, when chosen with foresight, can be one of the most powerful forms of good debt. Think of Samuel, who in 1995 took out a loan of $40,000 to attend law school. The weight of that debt frightened him, and many friends chose safer paths with less financial burden. But Samuel calculated that a legal career could yield 6 figures annually, far beyond the salary of his previous clerical job. After graduation, he joined a firm earning $120,000 a year. Within 4 years, his loans were paid off, and his career trajectory had changed forever. That debt was not a trap, but a bridge, carrying him from one life into another. But not every story begins with confidence. Some begin with desperation that transforms into possibility. Take the case of Maria and Jorge, a married couple in Mexico City during the early 1980s. They ran a tiny food stand, selling tacos and tamales to factory workers. Business was steady but small, barely covering their family expenses. They dreamed of opening a full restaurant, but had no capital. One day, after encouragement from a loyal customer, they applied for a government-backed small business loan of 10,000 pesos. With it, they rented a small storefront and bought proper equipment. The first months were difficult, but the quality of their food attracted crowds. Within 5 years, their single food stand had grown into a chain of 3 restaurants employing dozens. The loan that once seemed like a terrifying obligation became the foundation of their legacy. Strategic borrowing is about seeing possibility where others see barriers. When you understand that debt can act as leverage, you stop asking, "Can I afford this today?" and start asking, "Will this create enough tomorrow to justify the cost today?" The answer is not always yes. But for those who calculate wisely and act with discipline, the results can be life-changing. To see this in numbers, let's revisit Hannah's duplex. Her down payment of $10,000 gave her control over a $90,000 property. If the property rose in value by only 3% each year, that was nearly $3,000 annually. Add in the rent covering her mortgage, and Hannah effectively turned $10,000 into an engine producing thousands every year. Without borrowing, she would have needed to save $90,000 before seeing any return. Debt multiplied her timeline, collapsing decades into years. Even small-scale borrowing can be strategic. Consider Daniel, a freelance photographer in 2017. He was offered a contract to shoot weddings but lacked the professional equipment needed. The cameras and lenses would cost $8,000, and he had only $2,000 in savings. He hesitated, fearful of owing money, but after careful thought, he borrowed $6,000 on a small business loan. Within the first year, his wedding contracts earned him over $20,000. He repaid the loan and upgraded his business. By year 3, he was fully booked months in advance. That $6,000 debt, which once felt like a burden, became the gateway to a thriving career. As you listen to these stories, notice the common thread. Each person borrowed not for consumption, but for creation. They did not take loans to buy things that faded or broke. They borrowed to build, to expand, to invest. And in every case, the debt worked for them rather than against them. Strategic borrowing is not about recklessness. It is about courage guided by calculation. It requires you to face fear, but it rewards you with growth. Debt, when used this way, ceases to be a chain around your neck and becomes a key in your hand. It unlocks doors that remain closed to those who refuse to borrow. It transforms limitations into opportunities, carrying you further than your own resources could ever allow. And as you reflect on these stories, you may begin to ask yourself a different question. What door could open in your life if you were willing to borrow strategically, with wisdom and vision? Stories of strategic borrowing continue to reveal themselves in every generation, across different industries and circumstances. What they show is that opportunity often wears a disguise of risk, and those willing to accept the weight of responsibility are the ones who break through the limits of their environment. When you peel away the fear, you see ordinary people stepping into extraordinary outcomes because they borrowed not to consume but to create. Take the example of Clara in 2008. She was a young teacher in Atlanta, barely earning $35,000 a year. Most of her colleagues avoided debt at all costs, carrying the scars of credit card traps or watching family members lose homes during the financial crisis. Clara, however, noticed something others overlooked. Small houses in her neighborhood were selling for half the price they had fetched just 2 years earlier. One 3-bedroom house had dropped from $160,000 to just $85,000. Clara had saved only $12,000, but she decided to use it as a down payment and borrow the rest. Friends told her she was foolish to buy property when the market was collapsing. Yet 5 years later, that house was worth $140,000, and the tenants had paid down much of the mortgage. Clara used equity to borrow again, purchasing a second property. Today, she owns several rentals, each one funded through careful borrowing at the right moment. What seemed reckless to others became her doorway to freedom. Another story comes from across the world in Nairobi. In 2015, a young man named Kamau wanted to start a motorcycle taxi service. He had no capital, only a vision and determination. Motorcycles cost about $1,500 each, far more than he could save in years. He borrowed 2 motorcycles on credit from a local cooperative, agreeing to repay in monthly installments. Within months, the motorcycles were generating enough income not only to cover the payments, but to provide extra cash. Kamau expanded slowly, borrowing again to add more motorcycles. Within 5 years, he managed a fleet of 20, employing other drivers and earning more than he ever imagined. The cooperative loan that once felt like a dangerous gamble became the seed of an enterprise that lifted him and others out of poverty. The principle repeats in business after business. In 1984, Howard Schultz borrowed heavily to transform a small chain of coffee shops into what would become Starbucks. The initial loan seemed enormous for such a modest idea, convincing Americans to pay more for coffee in a cafe-style environment. Many investors thought it absurd. Yet Schultz used borrowed money to refine the brand, open new locations, and create an experience that reshaped global culture. The company is now worth billions and began with strategic borrowing guided by a bold vision. Not all stories are grand or global. Some happen in quiet towns with people who never appear in the news. Consider Miguel and Rosa, farmers in Argentina. In 2002, they faced a drought that threatened their livelihood. They could not afford irrigation equipment, which cost nearly $20,000. Selling their land seemed like the only option, but they decided to borrow from a regional bank instead, using their land as collateral. The loan felt terrifying because failure would mean losing everything. Yet the irrigation system saved their crops. Within 3 years, their yields had doubled, and they had repaid the loan in full. Today, their children run the farm, and the land is more valuable than ever. That single act of borrowing did not just save their farm, it saved their legacy. Numbers bring clarity to these stories. Imagine borrowing $25,000 at 6% annual interest. The cost is $1,500 a year. If you use it to buy furniture and electronics, in 5 years you have spent over $7,000 in interest, and the items would be nearly worthless. But if you use it to buy a food truck, earning $2,000 a month in profit, you would repay the loan in just over a year and enjoy years of income afterward. The same $25,000, depending on its purpose, could either drain you or empower you. Strategic borrowing is the art of making that choice wisely. Another dimension of these stories is timing. The most successful borrowers understand that markets move in cycles. Clara bought property when prices were low. Kamau expanded his fleet when demand for motorcycle taxis was rising. Schultz built Starbucks when consumer tastes were shifting. Strategic borrowing is not simply about taking on debt. It is about aligning debt with opportunity. Borrowing at the wrong time can cripple you, but borrowing at the right time can catapult you. Discipline is a constant theme. Every story of successful borrowing involves individuals who calculated, planned, and committed to repayment. They treated debt with respect, not as free money. They used it like a tool, not a toy. Anthony did not spend his $17,000 loan on dinners and clothes. He invested in fabric and rent. Hannah did not use her mortgage for a luxury lifestyle. She rented her property to cover expenses. These decisions may appear small, but they are the difference between drowning and thriving. What you must take from these lives is not the specific industries they chose, but the mindset they carried. They asked questions that many never ask. Will this debt create income? Will it appreciate in value? Can I manage the risk if things go wrong? They were not reckless, but neither were they paralyzed by fear. They stepped forward, knowing that growth never comes without uncertainty. As you hear these examples, imagine where they could intersect with your own life. Perhaps you have a skill that could become a business with the right equipment. Perhaps you have noticed a property that could generate steady rental income. Perhaps you have considered further education that could open doors to higher income. The question is not whether debt is dangerous. It always carries risk. The question is whether the return justifies that risk and whether you have the discipline to manage it. That is the essence of strategic borrowing. And as you stand with these stories echoing in your mind, you can feel the lesson settle. Debt itself is neutral, but when borrowed for creation with vision and discipline, it ceases to be a chain and becomes a key. That key has unlocked futures for countless people before you. It may one day unlock yours as well. Chapter 5. The Risks and How to Tame Them. By now you have seen how debt can become a tool of transformation, how it can build businesses, create wealth, and open doors that would otherwise stay locked. Yet no tool is without danger. The sharper the blade, the greater the chance it can cut you. This is why you must face the risks of debt honestly and learn how to tame them before they turn against you. Ignoring the dangers is as reckless as driving a car blindfolded. Acknowledging them is not pessimism. It is wisdom. To master debt, you must learn how to protect yourself from the very power that can enrich you. The first risk is overextension. Imagine trying to carry too many heavy boxes at once. At first you think you can manage, balancing them with outstretched arms. But one slips, then another, until they all crash around you. Overextension in debt is the same. You take one loan that feels manageable, then another, then another. Each one by itself seems fine, but together they weigh you down until a small change in income or expenses sends everything tumbling. Millions of families fell into this trap, in the years before 2008. They borrowed to buy homes larger than they could afford, confident that rising prices would cover their risk. When the market turned, the weight crushed them. Overextension is seductive because growth feels addictive, but it can destroy even the most promising ventures if not controlled. The second risk is variable conditions. Interest rates rise and fall, markets boom and crash, jobs come and go. You might take on a loan at comfortable terms, only to see conditions change in ways you cannot control. A business loan at 5% interest can feel safe until the economy shifts and you face 10% interest on a renewal. A mortgage that was easy to pay when your job was steady becomes suffocating if layoffs arrive. The risk is not only in what you borrow, but in the uncertain world that surrounds you. This is why taming debt requires planning for storms, not only for sunny days. The third risk is psychological. Debt does not only weigh on your finances, it weighs on your mind. The pressure of owing can steal sleep, erode confidence, and strain relationships. Couples fight over unpaid bills, parents feel shame before their children, and entrepreneurs collapse under the stress of repayments. This emotional toll is real and must be recognized. Even if the numbers say you are safe, your heart may still feel heavy. That is why taming debt is not only about interest rates and balances, but also about designing a relationship with borrowing that you can live with peacefully. Let us look at a concrete example. Imagine Sarah, who in 2011 borrowed $100,000 to start a fitness studio. Her monthly payment was $1,000, and her income easily covered it. But then competition arrived. Membership declined, profits shrank, and suddenly the same payment that once felt small became unbearable. She fell behind. Creditors called, and the dream nearly collapsed. What saved her was renegotiation. She restructured her loan, lowering the payment to $500 a month. This gave her breathing room to rebuild. Sarah's story shows that risk often lies not in the initial loan, but in how quickly conditions can change. Taming that risk meant having the humility to ask for new terms rather than letting pride drag her into ruin. Another example comes from history. In the late 1990s, the Asian financial crisis swept across countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. Many companies had borrowed heavily in dollars, assuming their local currencies would stay strong. When currencies collapsed, those debts doubled or tripled in real cost. Entire corporations failed overnight. What destroyed them was not the idea of borrowing, but the mismatch between the currency they borrowed in and the currency they earned in. They had ignored a basic risk, borrowing in one language while earning in another. The lesson is clear. Align your debts with your income streams, or risk disaster when the winds of finance change direction. So how do you tame these risks? The first step is building buffers. A wise borrower does not take every dollar offered, but leaves margin for uncertainty. If you can technically afford a mortgage of $2,000 a month, you might choose one of $1,500, leaving space for emergencies. If you borrow for business, you keep reserve to cover at least 6 months of payments, even if income slows. These buffers are like guardrails on a mountain road. They do not make the drive less steep, but they keep you from falling off a cliff. The second step is diversification. Never let a single loan or investment control your fate. If all your borrowing is tied to one property, one business, or one market, a single downturn can destroy you. Spread your risk. Borrow to fund projects in different areas, at different times, with different structures. Diversification is the art of making sure one fire does not burn down your entire house. The third step is discipline. Borrow only for creation, never for consumption. This principle alone eliminates most risk. When your loans are tied to income-producing assets, you give yourself the best chance of repayment. When they are tied to fading pleasures, you guarantee future pain. Discipline means saying no when the temptation to borrow for the wrong reason arises, even if lenders wave offers in your face. And finally, the fourth step is humility. Debt is powerful, and power requires respect. You must be willing to admit when a plan is failing, when conditions have changed, when you need to adjust course. Pride has destroyed more borrowers than bad numbers ever did. Those who survive and thrive are not the ones who never stumble, but the ones who recognize the stumble early and act decisively. Let's put numbers to this. Suppose you earn $5,000 monthly and your lender approves you for a loan requiring $3,000 in payments. On paper, it works, but you are leaving yourself with only $2,000 for living expenses, savings, and emergencies. A single medical bill or car repair could topple your budget. If instead you choose a loan requiring $1,500 a month, you keep more than half your income free. You may grow slower, but you will sleep better and survive storms. This is taming debt. Trading speed for sustainability. Risk will always accompany borrowing, just as danger always accompanies driving. The goal is not to eliminate it, which is impossible, but to manage it so that you stay in control. By recognizing overextension, variable conditions, psychological pressure, and hidden mismatches, you can step into debt with eyes open. And by building buffers, diversifying, disciplining, and humbling yourself, you tame the very beast that has devoured so many. Debt will never stop being risky, but risk is not the enemy. Unmanaged risk is. Once you learn to tame it, the same force that ruins lives becomes a force that builds them, and the silence of fear gives way to the steady confidence of mastery. Every generation produces stories not just of success through borrowing, but collapse under its weight. These are not tales meant to frighten you away from debt forever. They are cautionary lights meant to show you where the road narrows, where cliffs await, and where overconfidence blinds even the intelligent. If you ignore them, you may repeat their mistakes. If you heed them, you may walk safely past the traps that swallowed others. One of the most common risks is the illusion of permanence. When times are good, you assume they will stay good. A steady job feels eternal. A booming market looks unshakable. A thriving business appears invincible. Many people borrow based on that illusion. They take loans with confidence, certain their income will remain the same or even increase. But history is a brutal teacher. Recessions, layoffs, pandemics, and natural disasters strike without warning. Those who borrowed too close to the edge find themselves drowning when conditions shift. A wise borrower never assumes permanence. They plan for the possibility that good times may turn sour, and they design their debt to survive even the storm. Another serious risk is hidden costs. You may look at an interest rate of 5% and think it manageable, only to discover layers of fees, penalties, and adjustments buried in the fine print. Adjustable rate mortgages, for example, destroyed countless households in the early 2000s. Families took loans with low introductory rates, believing they could handle them. But when those rates reset upward, payments doubled overnight, pushing many into foreclosure. The lesson is simple. Debt is a contract, and contracts hide power in their details. To tame debt, you must read, question, and calculate everything before you sign. There is also the risk of temptation once credit becomes available. The very act of approval can feel like validation, as if the lender is saying you deserve more than you can afford. Many fall into the trap of expanding lifestyle instead of building assets. They refinance homes to buy luxury cars, borrow on credit cards for vacations, or take personal loans for entertainment. In the short run, it feels like abundance. In the long run, it becomes shackles. The discipline to resist temptation is perhaps the hardest part of taming debt. Lenders profit from your lack of restraint, but you must remember that their approval does not equal wisdom. They are not giving you a gift. They are setting a hook. Psychological pressure deepens the danger. Debt can create anxiety so strong that it paralyzes action. Some people avoid opening bills, stop answering phone calls, or even abandon opportunities because they feel trapped. This mental burden can be heavier than the financial one because it robs you of clarity. Taming debt requires not just financial strategies, but also mental ones. You must keep your perspective. A loan is not a death sentence. It is a contract. Contracts can be renegotiated, refinanced, or repaid. The moment you stop hiding from numbers and face them directly is the moment you take back power from fear. Let us anchor this with an example. Imagine Victor, a restaurant owner in 2019. He borrowed $200,000 to expand his dining area. Business was strong and the loan seemed safe. Then the global pandemic arrived in 2020. Suddenly, customers vanished, revenues collapsed, and Victor faced loan payments with almost no income. Many owners in his position defaulted, but Victor acted quickly. He contacted his lender, explained the crisis, and negotiated a temporary pause in payments. He also shifted to delivery service, using his kitchen to produce takeout meals. These moves did not erase the risk, but they allowed him to survive. By 2022, business recovered, and he resumed payments. Victor's story shows that taming risk is not about predicting every disaster. It is about responding with flexibility and courage when the unpredictable happens. You must also consider the risk of pride. Too often, borrowers cling to failing ventures because admitting defeat feels like weakness. They take on new loans to cover old ones, spiraling deeper into danger rather than stepping back. Pride whispers, "I can still make it work," even when the numbers scream otherwise. The wise borrower knows when to cut losses, sell assets, or restructure rather than digging a deeper hole. Pride has ruined more businesses than competition ever did. Here is another numerical illustration. Suppose you borrow $100,000 at 7% interest with annual payments of $7,000. If your investment generates $15,000 each year, you are safe with $8,000 net gain. But what if your income drops to $6,000 annually? Suddenly, you are negative $1,000 every year. If you continue borrowing more to cover the gap, you may find yourself owing not just $100,000, but $200,000. This is how small gaps turn into avalanches. Taming debt means monitoring the numbers constantly, never letting small cracks grow into canyons. Diversification, again, offers protection. Imagine two entrepreneurs. The first borrows $50,000 and puts it all into a single cafe. If the cafe fails, they lose everything. The second borrows the same amount but splits it into two ventures, half for a cafe, half for an online store. If one fails, the other may survive. Diversification does not remove risk, but it spreads it so that one blow cannot destroy you. This principle has saved countless investors, and it applies to borrowing just as much as to investing. Finally, there's a subtle risk of forgetting your why. Many borrowers start with noble intentions to build, to invest, to create. But as success arrives, they lose discipline. They borrow not to expand wisely, but to show off, to impress, to indulge. They forget that the purpose of debt is multiplication, not consumption. This shift can undo years of careful work. The antidote is constant self-reflection. Before you borrow, and even after you succeed, ask yourself, does this serve my long-term vision or just my short-term pride? Debt will never be harmless. It is fire, and fire can burn. But fire under control is also light, warmth, and progress. Taming risk is not about extinguishing the flame, but about mastering its use. You prepare for storms, you read the fine print, you resist temptation, you diversify, and you remain humble. With these practices, you do not eliminate risk, you harness it. And when you harness it, debt ceases to be a predator stalking you in the dark and becomes a servant that works quietly in your favor. Chapter 6. Building Your Legacy with Debt. When you think of legacy, you may imagine family heirlooms, a house passed down through generations, or a business that carries your name long after you are gone. But legacy is more than inheritance. It is a mark you leave on the world, the story others tell about your life, and the foundation you build for those who come after you. Debt, when used wisely, can be one of the strongest tools to shape that legacy. Instead of being remembered as chains that weighed you down, loans and obligations can become bridges to opportunities that echo far beyond your lifetime. Legacy is built not in a single decision, but in a series of choices, often invisible to outsiders. A father who borrows to buy land for farming and leaves it to his children has planted roots deeper than soil. A mother who takes a loan to educate herself and opens doors for her family has invested not only in her career, but in generations. Debt, when used for creation, expands your impact beyond your personal years. It is a way of stretching your influence into futures you may never see. Consider the story of Elias in 1979. He was a bus driver in a small town in Brazil, raising 3 children on modest wages. He wanted his children to have better lives, but his salary barely covered food and shelter. Against the advice of relatives, Elias borrowed enough to buy a small plot of land and build a basic rental house. The loan terrified him, and for the first few years the rent barely covered payments. But as the town grew, demand for housing increased. Within a decade, the property was worth 10 times the amount he borrowed. By the time Elias passed away, his children each inherited not just one house, but the knowledge that strategic borrowing had changed their destiny. His debt did not enslave them, it freed them. That is legacy. Legacy is also about institutions. Look at universities, hospitals, and charities across the world. Many were built not only with donations, but also with borrowed capital. Leaders took loans, issued bonds, and accepted debt because they knew the return would not only be financial, but also human. They understood that creating a lasting institution often requires resources far beyond what current savings can provide. Without borrowing, many of the schools and hospitals that shaped entire regions would never have existed. Debt, in their hands, became a tool for generational impact. Numbers tell the story clearly. Imagine borrowing $100,000 at 6% interest to purchase an apartment building. You collect rents that cover expenses and payments, leaving only a modest profit each year. On the surface, it may seem unimpressive, but 30 years later, when the loan is fully repaid, you own a building worth perhaps $500,000. Your children inherit it debt-free, enjoying steady income for the rest of their lives. What began as a frightening obligation becomes a permanent source of stability for generations. That is a transformation of debt into legacy. Legacy through debt is not limited to property or institutions. It can also be intellectual. Think of a young woman named Priya in 2004 who borrowed $50,000 to attend medical school in India. The loan consumed her thoughts, and for years she lived frugally to repay it. Yet, once she became a doctor, her income allowed her to support her parents, educate her siblings, and eventually open a small clinic in her community. The debt that once seemed overwhelming became the channel through which she built a lasting legacy of healing. Without it, her skills, her clinic, and her impact would never have existed. Of course, legacy built with debt requires discipline. Many people borrow recklessly, leaving behind not assets but burdens. Children inherit unpaid credit cards, repossessed homes, or businesses collapsing under obligations. That is not legacy, that is liability. The difference lies in purpose. Debt tied to consumption dies with you, or worse, outlives you in the form of unpaid bills. Debt tied to creation continues giving long after you are gone. Take a lesson from John and Margaret, a couple in London in 1983. They borrowed heavily to buy a modest pub, turning it into a family business. Their children grew up working beside them, learning the trade. By the time John and Margaret retired, the loan was paid, and the pub had become a neighborhood institution. Their children expanded it into multiple locations, each one carrying their parents' name. The debt that once frightened them became the seed of a legacy that spanned decades. When you think about your own life, ask yourself, what do you want to leave behind? Do you want your debt to tell a story of reckless spending, or do you want to tell a story of courage, vision, and creation? Every loan you take becomes part of that story. Every repayment, every risk, every outcome shapes the narrative of your legacy. And when you borrow with this in mind, you begin to treat debt not as a temporary convenience, but as a permanent investment in the future. The most powerful legacies are not measured in money alone, but in impact. A loan that allows you to open a business creates jobs for others. A mortgage that secures a family home provides stability for children. An educational loan that funds your degree may inspire younger relatives to pursue their own studies. Debt, when tied to creation, ripples outward in ways you cannot always predict. What feels like a financial decision today may become a turning point for dozens of lives tomorrow. As you consider all of this, remember that legacy does not wait until you're gone. It begins the moment you choose how to borrow. Each loan can either chain your descendants to the past or carry them forward into a better future. The choice is not about whether to borrow, but how. If you borrow with vision, discipline, and humility, you build more than wealth. You build a story that others will live inside long after you are gone. Legacy is not simply about money, though money often shapes the opportunities a family inherits. True legacy is a combination of resources, lessons, and habits passed from one generation to the next. Debt, when mastered, can become one of the most powerful teaching tools you leave behind. By showing your children or those who watch you that borrowing can be done with discipline and vision, you hand them not only assets but also wisdom. And wisdom, more than gold or property, is what endures. Consider a man named George in 1965. He worked as a machinist in Detroit, earning a modest wage. He borrowed $15,000 to buy a small house for his family, terrified of the 30-year mortgage he signed. For decades he worked faithfully, making payments month after month. His children grew up watching him balance his books, refusing to take on frivolous loans, and always reminding them that debt must serve a purpose. When George passed away, the house was nearly paid off. His children finished the payments and inherited a debt-free home. But more importantly, they inherited his example. That borrowing, if treated with respect, can provide shelter and stability. George's legacy was not just a house. It was a financial discipline that became part of his children's character. Legacy grows larger when debt is used not only to protect, but to multiply. Think of Helena, a widow in Lisbon in the late 1980s. She inherited a small apartment from her husband, but wanted to secure a stronger future for her 3 daughters. She borrowed the equivalent of $50,000 to purchase 2 more apartments in a nearby neighborhood, renting them out to students. At first, the pressure was enormous. For years, nearly all her rental income went straight to payments. But Helena stayed disciplined. By the time her daughters finished school, the loans were repaid and the apartments had doubled in value. Helena left behind not only property, but also an income stream that continues to support her family decades later. Her debt became a staircase for her daughters to climb higher than she ever could. It is important to understand that legacy is not built only in times of prosperity. Sometimes it is in the midst of hardship that the seeds of legacy are planted. In 2009, during the global financial crisis, a man named David lost his job in construction. With little savings, he faced the possibility of losing his home. Rather than surrender, he took a small loan of $10,000 to buy equipment and start a handyman service. The risk was terrifying because if the business failed, he would have nothing. But he worked tirelessly, repairing homes, painting walls, and building relationships with customers. Within 2 years, his business was stable, and by 5 years, it was thriving. His children did not only inherit the income from his work, they inherited the memory of a father who refused to give up, who used borrowed money as a lifeline and turned it into a foundation. That story will outlast the business itself. Legacy is also about the ripple effect of what you create. Imagine a teacher who borrows money to pursue a master's degree, increasing her salary and opening the door to leadership roles. With her higher income, she funds scholarships for students in her community. Those students go on to become professionals who support others. In this way, one person's decision to borrow wisely creates ripples that touch hundreds of lives. Debt, when aligned with purpose, multiplies not only wealth but also influence. Of course, the opposite is also true. Bad debt can poison a legacy. Children can inherit not just unpaid balances, but also the habits of avoidance, fear, and recklessness. If they grow up seeing parents overwhelmed by credit card bills or payday loans, they may internalize that borrowing is always destructive. This is why taming debt during your lifetime is not just for your own benefit, but for theirs. You are modeling the relationship they will one day have with money. They will either learn that debt is a curse to fear or a tool to master, depending on how you live. Numbers illustrate this truth with sharp clarity. Suppose you take out a mortgage of $150,000 for a property. Over 30 years, you repay it faithfully, and by the time the loan is complete, the property is worth $400,000. You leave it to your children, who inherit not just a house, but nearly $250,000 in equity. Compare this to taking out the same $150,000 in consumer loans for cars, vacations, and luxuries. 30 years later, the debt is gone, the items are worthless, and nothing remains for your children. The amount borrowed was the same. The legacy could not be more different. This is a hidden power of building legacy with debt. It is not about how much you borrow, but about how you direct what you borrow toward lasting impact. A loan can either buy fading moments or build permanent foundations. It can either die with you or outlive you. The choice is yours. Think of one last story. In 1992, a man named Kenji in Tokyo borrowed heavily to open a small printing company. The loan was the size of a mountain to him, nearly $200,000, more than he had ever imagined owing. For years, he lived simply, pouring every yen into repayments and growth. By the time he retired, the business had grown into a large company employing over 100 workers. His children inherited not only the business, but also the reputation of their family name in the community. The debt that once kept Kenji awake at night became the foundation of a legacy that provided income and dignity for countless families. His story is repeated in different forms across the world. Those who dare to borrow with vision often leave behind more than they ever dreamed. As you reflect on legacy, you must remember this. Your choices echo. Every debt you sign, every loan you repay, every risk you embrace or avoid becomes part of your story. The question is not whether debt will shape your legacy. It will. The real question is what kind of legacy you will build with it. Will your loans be remembered as chains of consumption or as ladders of creation? Will your children inherit burdens or opportunities? Will your community speak of you as someone who wasted or as someone who built? Debt alone cannot answer these questions. Only you can. And when you choose wisely, when you borrow for vision rather than vanity, when you tame risk rather than ignore it, you craft a legacy that stands firm long after the contracts are forgotten. Debt, in the end, is just ink on paper. Legacy is what you carve into time.